Hi everyone, welcome to Playing Up the Dusty End with Matt Stead. This week we're going to concentrate on chords and playing some chord shapes up and down the fretboard, which is going to allow us to play in a completely different way and really expand our knowledge of chords all over the ukulele fretboard. We're going to apply some of the knowledge that we learned last week in terms of scales and melodies, playing up and down the fretboard, and we're going to use that to help us learn these chord shapes and where they are. So this lesson is really going to concentrate on something called movable chord shapes. So let's jump right in. What is a movable chord shape? So a movable chord shape is basically any chord where we're covering all four strings of the ukulele. Now that means that when we move that shape up and down the fretboard, it becomes new chords, higher or lower in pitch. So for instance, this D7 can become a D sharp 7 and an E7 and an F7. And that's because it's a movable chord shape that we can take all the way up and down the neck. Now, there's one bit of knowledge which, if you don't already know it, will allow you to fly on the ukulele and playing up and down the fretboard. When I learned this, it really changed my kind of view of the ukulele and the things that I could do with it. Now, every chord shape that you can think of in the world can become a movable chord. I'll show you what I mean. All we have to do is picture the nut of our ukulele, this white bit of plastic or bone at the end of your ukulele, and imagine that we're going to replace it with our index finger, okay, our first finger, or our pointer finger as some people call it. I'll show you what I mean. Let's take our good old C7 chord, okay, which you would have learned quite rightly using your index finger, or that pointer finger, by playing the first fret of the A string, right? Now try doing exactly the same chord, but use your second finger, okay? The reason we're doing that is it frees up this finger to come and act as the bar or the nut of our ukulele. Now, because we're pressing down behind the nut of the ukulele, at the moment that has no effect, does it, on the sound? We've still got a bog standard C7. But if we took that shape, just picture this shape, and we took it up 1, 2 frets higher, and we push down with this index finger, thumb on the back, okay? And we push down with this index finger, keeping this finger where it was for a C7. Some of you might already know we have a D7 chord now, right? Don't worry too much about the sound that you get out. It might sound a bit like this at the moment whilst you learn how to do these bars. We'll go into technique in a later video, but at the moment I just want you to learn where to play these chords and learn how it works. So we've taken a C7 chord and we've turned it into a D7 chord just by moving it higher. Now, it doesn't have to be bar chords like this. It works with all chord shapes. Sometimes we don't need to put our whole index finger over the fretboard. I'll show you what I mean. This one's a bit more tricky. What I'd like you to do is try playing a bog standard E7 chord first, okay? Normal E7 chord. So from nose to toes, the frets that you're going to press down are 1, 2, 0, 2 for a bog standard E7, right? Now we want this finger to act as this nut, right? And it can't at the moment because it's having to cover this note. So this is a bit tricky. I want you to try and play an E7 chord, but you're not allowed to use this finger. It's trickier than you think, isn't it? We've got to use our second, third and fourth fingers. You've got to use that little finger to still put that chord on 1, 2, 0, 2. Okay, now remember our finger is going to act as this nut. So we're going to keep this shape, but our finger is going to act on as the nut in this fret. Now what we could do is we could take that whole shape, and watch my fingers really carefully, keeping that whole shape the same, taking it up 1 fret. Okay, and then we could bar the first fret and we have a movable chord shape. So instead of E7, we now have F7 because we've moved 1 fret along, okay? Now, when we moved along and I barred that first fret, To make it easier, I got a bit of a squeak there because that's kind of an awkward one to do. Actually, it's not too bad now, but I did get a squeak first time. An easier way to play this chord, because most of the strings are already covered, aren't they, with the notes that we play with this finger, we only need to cover the empty string, the one that doesn't have a finger on it, which is the third string down, the E string. So when I play this movable chord, rather than barring the whole of that first fret, what I can do is just put that first finger down on the third string down, okay? And there we've taken an E7 shape and we've moved it up and we've created, some of you might know this already, an F7 shape. Okay. Now all we need to do, like magic to play these chords all over the fretboard, is apply this knowledge, this chromatic scale that we learnt last week. So if we know that every movement along the chromatic scale is one fret on your ukulele, we can start to work out what all these new chords are. I'll show you what I mean. Let's play that E7 one more time, okay, here. But without using your index finger, okay? Okay. Now, we're starting at E for E7. If we move one movement along the chromatic scale and we move up one fret, watch my fingers really carefully, keeping that shape, I slide up one fret and I cover the empty string, which was the third one down. Because I've gone one step along the chromatic scale, I've gone from an E7 to an F7. We keep the 7 there because it's the same type of chord. If I move that shape then, all 4 fingers, if you're doing this, just kind of slacken off the tension as you move it so that all your fingers move easily. Move it up to the next chord, the next fret, making sure all the fingers are in the same place as they were. We now, because we've moved up one movement, have an F sharp. If we go one further, G sharp. So once you've got this shape, you know an E7, F7, F sharp 7, G7, G sharp 7, A7, A sharp 7, all up and down the fretboard. Isn't that magic? Absolutely brilliant. There's another way of thinking about these chords and working out, say I played that chord shape way up here and I couldn't remember, which pitch that chord is, so what type of 7th chord that is. Is it, a G7 or an F7 or an E7? There's an easy way to work it out, combining some of the knowledge we worked on last week. And that's to find the root note of the chord. So if we come back to where we started, with it down here as an E7, the root note is literally the letter that the chord is named after. So the root note of an E7 is E. The root note of a D7 is D. The root note of a D sharp 7 is D sharp, and so on and so forth. So if we find out what string the root note is on, we can use that for something really cool in a second. So let's see if we can find the E note in an E7. It's not this note, because we know that's a G sharp. It's not this note, because when we did our C major scale last week, we know that this one is a D, right? So we do know that the E in an E7, because of our C major scale, is the third string down, okay, from nose to toes. So the E in the E7 is on the E string. So if we were playing that shape one fret higher, the note on the E string now is an F. So C, D, E, F. So we know this chord must be an F7. Okay? And we can use that knowledge we've learned all over the fretboard. If we played that same shape right up here, you can do it yourself, or you don't have to if you're not sure. I just want you to soak this in at the moment. If I play that same chord shape right up here at the 5th, 6th and 7th frets, all I have to do to work out what the name of that chord is to work out what note this is, because it's the same string that our root was on earlier. And we can use that scale that we learned last week, F, G, A. There it is. So that chord is an A7, E7, F7, because we have an F. Up here, because we have an A, A7. And that's one way to think about how to memorise these chords up and down the fretboard. Really magical. But there's an easier way to do it. When you learnt chords, as I said earlier, I think, you didn't learn all of the chords in one go, did you? You probably learned maybe a C, a G7 and an F. You didn't learn all the sevenths, all the suspendeds, all the major chords, all the minor chords. You learnt a few at a time. We're going to do the same thing. If you just learn a couple of these shapes up the fretboard and you combine that with a little bit of knowledge, you can then start to play all sorts of chords up and down a fretboard just by moving them up and down and remembering them. I'll show you what I mean. If rather than trying to learn what this chord is, and this chord, 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 so on and so forth. If I just remember one of them, and a really common one that's going to come up all the time, a G7. We're going to play it as a G7. Okay. And to do that, we're going to take this E7 shape. Okay. So 1, 2, nothing, 2, 1, 2, 0, 2. We're not allowed to use our index finger. We're going to move it up 1 and fill in the blank for an F7. We're going to move that whole shape, including that fingernail, up 1 fret higher, F sharp 7. And we're going to move it 1 fret higher again for a G7. Okay, I'm going to go into this in a lot more detail in the next video in a minute, so don't panic if you can't remember that. But what I end up with is a chord that, from nose to toes, is 4, 5, 3, 5. Okay, see if you can get your fingers into that position. It's a bit like an F chord with these extra 2 notes with your last 2 fingers. So 4, 5, 3, 5. Now that one's really common. If I learn that that's a G7, I can use that as a basis to work out other chords. Because if that's a G7, 2 steps higher on our chromatic scale is an A7. And I'm going to come back, G7. 2 steps lower is an F7. So rather than trying to remember them all over the fretboard, if I just remember one right in the middle, this G7, and that's what I'd like you to do. Chords that are near it using the same shape, you're going to be able to work out really easy. And you're going to start to build from that knowledge of that G7 all over the fretboard. Okay. What we're going to do in the next video, we're going to start with just 2 of these shapes to learn some new chords, just like this G7 that you can then build upon. We're going to play Carina Blues by Blind Lemon Jefferson. First of all, using open chords down here, and then a couple of shapes up and down the fretboard. And as this playlist or season of lessons goes on, you're going to learn new shapes a few at a time, rather than trying to overload yourself with different systems and root notes and things like that. We're just going to learn a few shapes, and it's going to allow you to play all these chords up and down the fretboard. So join me in the next video when we're going to put this to practical use, and hopefully you'll get that little light bulb moment where it will start to click.